So we've just navigated the winding paths of political thought and the rise of late Romanticism. Now let's pivot to a fascinating parallel track, how German idealism wrestled with the arts. We're immediately thrown into a head-scratcher. On one hand, Hegel in the 1820s is basically saying, look, folks, art science is more crucial now than ever before. But then, flash back to 1800, and Schelling is declaring art the only true and eternal organ of philosophy. Talk about a philosophical tug-of-war. Gadamer nails it. This isn't just about aesthetics. It's about the big questions of modernity itself, specifically how philosophy, after taking a hit from the sciences, started looking back towards poetry, acknowledging art's own claim to truth, even if it meant creating a bit of a conceptual knot with scientific truth. So, what sparked this intense focus on art? Well, it wasn't out of the blue. Thinkers like Hume, Herder, and Kant's earlier work were already poking holes in the Enlightenment's neat idea of a rationally structured world. Around the same time, Baumgarten was giving sensuous perception a serious upgrade, calling it aesthetica. And then Kant, in his critique of judgment, really tried to bring art into his critical system. The vibe was changing. We needed new ways to understand how our minds actively shape knowledge and ethics, not just passively receive information. This naturally bumped up the importance of aesthetic experience. Enter Friedrich Schiller, championing aesthetic education, using art to communicate the idea of freedom to everyone, making art explicitly political. This feeds directly into early Romanticism and that famous oldest system program, which basically says the highest act of reason is an aesthetic act, because it bridges the gap between the tangible stuff of art and the intangible idea of freedom, something that can't show up directly but gets symbolized through the artwork. It's like art becomes the translator for ideas too big for words alone. Now the story continues. Schelling, after all that excitement about art being central, eventually cools off a bit. He develops his ideas, writes his philosophy of art, but then, poof, art isn't the cornerstone anymore. Hegel, initially super jazzed about art, reconciling the subject and object, also becomes much more cautious in his later aesthetics. And then, boom. After Hegel dies, thinkers like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche crash the party, heavily influenced by idealism, but ultimately rejecting its core assumptions, especially regarding the primacy of reason or spirit. So this common narrative, it's not wrong per se, but it misses something crucial. As Gadamer hinted, it assumes there's a clean split between philosophy and art that philosophy can just rediscover. But if the whole point is the tension between competing claims to truth, how can philosophy define the nature of that very divide? It's like trying to map your own blind spot. This brings us to the heart of the matter. The German idealists were fundamentally asking, can we build new foundations for knowledge that replace the old metaphysics Kant knocked down? And part of that project involves figuring out the relationship between philosophical truth, scientific truth, and artistic truth all over again. Interestingly, the very modern concept of art as we know it, distinct from just copying reality or telling stories, really crystallized during this period. Why? Secularization. Creative stuff started breaking free from being solely about God or serving specific social roles. This led to this idea that imagination could break the rules of a medium, painting, music, whatever, and create things that demanded you look beyond those rules to appreciate them. Art wasn't just about mimesis or entertainment, it was about revealing the world in unique ways. And guess what? This thinking about art ran parallel to revolutionary ideas about language. Hamann, Herder, Humboldt, Schleiermacher arguing that language doesn't just describe the world, it helps constitute it, makes intelligibility possible. These two streams fed each other, pushing the boundaries of what art could be and do. And here's where things get really interesting, especially concerning music. Suddenly, instrumental music, music without words, goes from being the little sibling of the arts to the cool elder sibling, maybe even the king. Think Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert composing masterpieces that arguably changed the game. Why this shift? Because wordless music is notoriously hard to pin down with representational language. It resists being easily translated into concepts about objects or events. This resistance became a signpost for a deeper shift happening in philosophy, a questioning of whether thought is just about representing what's already out there. Friedrich Schlegel, one of the sharpest minds of early Romanticism, really hammers this home. He famously says, for ages people tried to apply math to music and painting, now try it the other way around. What does that mean? It means he's flipping the script, suggesting music might have something more fundamental to teach us than mathematics. something philosophy needs to listen to. He argues that since language struggles with feeling, the root of consciousness, we need something else, like music, to add communication and representation. For Schlegel, music isn't just art, it's almost a philosophical language higher than mere art. So, understanding Schlegel isn't just about music, it's about diving into the core concerns of German idealism, particularly this slippery concept of feeling. So, what exactly is this feeling Schlegel is talking about? It's central to German idealism. Their big goal was to bridge the gaps Kant created between appearances and things in themselves, necessity and freedom, the receptive mind and the spontaneous mind. They felt these divisions threatened to make experience itself incomprehensible. Kant said experience needs an I that accompanies it, but he didn't really tell us how philosophers can get a handle on this I. Jacobi, in his work on Spinoza, puts it bluntly: we only have a feeling, even of our own existence, not a concept. See the difference? Concepts are like rules for identifying objects. This is a tree, that is a rock. But how do you apply a rule to identify yourself? Your continuous selfhood is what allows you to recognize objects consistently in the first place. So, this continuity seems to imply an immediate awareness, a feeling of being yourself, that can't be reduced to applying general rules or concepts. It's something more direct, something you can't fully communicate in a universal way. Schleiermacher later captures this beautifully. He says, as thinkers we are only in the single act of thought, but as beings we are the unity of all single acts and moments. That being part, that unity across time, that's feeling, immediate self-consciousness. Think about it. You and I can share knowledge because knowledge relies on common rules, things we can talk about. But can you truly access my feeling right now, the way I experience this moment? Probably not in the same way. It transcends any specific thought or concept. This leads to a big idea. If we want to communicate the feeling that gives coherence to our experience, we need non-conceptual tools. And guess who already pointed towards this? Kant himself. In his Critique of Judgment, he dives into judgments of taste, why we say something is beautiful, not just pleasing. He suggests there's a feeling of pleasure in aesthetic perception, arising from a sense of coherence in nature. This isn't just subjective whim, it hints at a deeper connection between our cognitive powers and the structure of nature itself. The possibility of agreeing on beauty, Kant implies, points to a shared, supersensuous foundation linking nature and freedom. Kant gets even more explicit. He argues that the ability to reach consensus on a feeling is the necessary condition for the universal communicability of our cognition. Mind-blowing, right? He even uses a musical analogy. He talks about the tuning or Attunementstimmung of our cognitive faculties, how they resonate with different objects. This attunement, he says, can only be determined by feeling, not by concepts. Suddenly, Schlegel's radical idea, inverting the hierarchy, putting music above math, starts to make sense. If scientific understanding relies on mathematical concepts, and if those concepts themselves require a pre-existing shared understanding, a common sense rooted in feeling, then what music expresses, this non-conceptual feeling, must be fundamental to philosophy itself. It's the bedrock upon which conceptual thinking is built. So, the romantic, seemingly wild insistence on the centrality of art, especially wordless music, actually finds surprising support right within Kant's own framework. The deepest connection between us and the world, it seems, happens at the level of immediate feeling, not mediated by concepts. So we land on this tension, immediacy versus mediation. How German idealism and the Romantics diverged often came down to how they handled this non-conceptual immediacy of feeling. At its core, it's a debate about the limits and nature of conceptual thinking. This tension plays out everywhere, especially in trying to solve the old Cartesian problem. How does the thinking world connect to the world of things? Jacobi, interpreting Spinoza, basically said, everything we know is defined by what it's not. Knowledge is always mediated, conditional. You trace conditions back, and you hit a regress, seemingly unable to reach an unconditioned starting point. Observable nature is just conditioned stuff. So, any sense of the unconditioned has to be beyond sensible nature, leading Jacobi to favor theology. Kant, though, offered a different path. He argued that the spontaneity of understanding, our productive imagination working through schemata, provides an unconditioned ground for understanding the conditioned world of intuitions. Imagination, in a way, stands outside the causal chain of appearances. Fichte takes this productive imagination idea and runs with it in his Wissenschaftslehre. His big question: how do we relate the conditioned world of nature to the unconditioned intellect, or will, without falling into dualism? If you try to explain the intellect, you mediate it, relate it to something else, leading to another regress. But if self-consciousness is purely immediate, how can we even access it? Access requires a mediated relationship. Fichte's solution? Intellectual intuition. This is the ability to reflect on your own thinking process. For him, this is the only place where subject and object are immediately identical, the ultimate unconditioned ground. But here's the rub, pointed out by Manfred Frank. Even intellectual intuition involves a kind of duality, looking at yourself. The Romantics, like Schlegel, rejected this and went back to feeling irreflexive, immediate. Fichte argued that a purely deterministic world couldn't produce a self-determining subject. He assumed the I had to come first. This puts mind and will firmly above nature. However, Fichte knew his system had a blind spot. Philosophy couldn't fully explain the free activity it relied on. How do you objectify freedom conceptually without making it lose its freedom? There's a necessary opacity, a limit to what philosophy can say about the ground of knowledge itself. Enter Schelling, trying to bridge these gaps in his system of transcendental idealism. He wants to combine Fichte's focus on the productive I, Spinoza's idea of nature as a productive ground, natura naturans, and the Romantics' emphasis on art. His big claim, freedom can become objective through art. This would show that the driving force in nature and the driving force in the mind are ultimately the same, overcoming Kant's split and bringing humanity back into a purposeful nature. He sees an activity that's both conscious, in free action, and unconscious, in producing the world. Where does this happen? Within consciousness itself, in aesthetic activity. For Schelling, the objective world nature is just the primordial, unconscious poetry of the mind. The job of the philosophy of art is to show how aesthetic creation, making the unconscious visible in artworks, mirrors philosophical production, the internal work of intellectual intuition. The payoff? Aesthetic intuition is just intellectual intuition that has become objective. Art makes visible what philosophy can only present internally. This clever move aims to solve Fichte's problem of explaining freedom. Schelling lays this out in a neat chiasmus, a crossover structure. Nature starts unconsciously, ends up conscious with the self-determining I. Production itself isn't purposeful, but the product is. In aesthetic activity, the I starts consciously, subjectively, but ends up unconscious or objective in relation to the artwork. Where does this idea come from? Kant's theory of genius. Kant said genius is nature giving the rule to art. He stressed that fully conscious, rule-bound art production can't create true art. Art always breaks new ground, establishes new rules. Schelling takes this further. Nature itself is unconscious productivity. Even when an artist consciously decides to create, they tap into that unconscious aspect. The magic is that this interplay of conscious and unconscious creates something intelligible, something that resists simple explanation by laws. That's why Schelling claims the artwork offers insights science or philosophy can never fully capture. It's endlessly interpretable. Think about a piece of music. Yes, its physical vibrations, pitches, durations, explainable physically. But none of that makes it Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. Its meaning depends on listeners freely hearing significances that go beyond the physical facts or even the composer's intent. It's a different order of reality. Okay, but hold on. Doesn't everyone agree what counts as art? Isn't there disagreement across cultures and time? This is a standard objection to Schelling's view. His response, leaning heavily on the romantic side, is fascinating. No, that resistance to being pinned down by a definition is precisely what makes art significant. If art could be captured by a concept, a rule, then it would cease to be art in the vital sense. It would become just another classifiable object. Art's refusal to be neatly categorized is what challenges our ideas and opens up new ways of seeing the world. This resonates with contemporary ideas about metaphor. Thinkers like Donald Davidson argue that metaphors work because they resist being translated back into literal language. They make us notice things, disclose the world in a way literal rules can't. Schelling saw language similarly. Words are both products of unconscious productivity and conscious meaning-making. Nature itself, he said, is like a secret poem written in miraculous script, and meaning shows itself through words just as it does through art. The artist's job is to reveal the unlimited within the limited product, to transcend the endless task of science and philosophy by showing the productive power behind the sensible world. It's this resistance, this refusal to be fully captured, that connects metaphor and the artwork. Schelling's system ends with a powerful call, a return of science, meaning both philosophy and natural sciences, to poetry. How? Through a new mythology, Not made by one poet, but imagined by a whole new race, a collective consciousness. A bold idea. It was influential, but Schelling never quite spelled out how this would work. Fast forward to Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy in 1872. In a world dominated by positivism and materialism, Nietzsche basically said, "Wake up. Science is just another form of art, another imposition of order, like ancient mythology, onto a world that's ultimately contingent." Both Schelling and Nietzsche were deeply worried about nihilism, the idea that modern science, by reducing everything to sufficient reason, strips the world of deeper meaning. Even if their solutions seem questionable, they were onto something important. Maybe we shouldn't just subordinate all thinking to the sciences. So, what does the rest of German idealism, particularly the later reflections on art, offer in this ongoing debate about meaning and value? Interestingly, Nietzsche himself didn't stick with the early view where art was paramount. In his philosophy of art from 1802 to 3, philosophy gets equal billing, but the theme of language as art persists. He makes this striking claim. Very few people reflect upon the fact that even the language in which they express themselves is the most complete work of art. Think about that. Language for Schelling is the direct expression of ideals, knowledge, thought, feeling, will in something real. Therefore, language itself is art. This leads to a key insight. Art and philosophy are two different paths to constructing the same absolute identity. Beauty is the indifference of freedom and necessity seen in a real material object, the artwork. Truth is the same indifference expressed in an ideal system of thought, philosophy. His philosophy of identity hinges on the idea that all intelligible reality is a primary speaking. It's both knowable through ideal concepts and manifested as real matter, just like ideal meaning relates to real words. Schelling then lays out an ascending hierarchy of the arts, based on how much they balance the ideal and the real, the infinite and the finite. Music, most tied to time, is the most finite. Then visual arts, literature, and the pinnacle, drama. He even muses if opera could evolve back into something like ancient Greek drama combined with music and song. Notice the shift here compared to the system. The system suggested the insight could only be grasped through the artwork itself. Here, in the philosophy of art, it seems the truth of art is realized in philosophy's systematic account of the arts. This creates a tension. If language itself is a work of art, mixing the ideal and the real, how can philosophy, which relies on language, be purely an ideal construction? Hammond had already argued back in 1784 that our understanding is always tied to a particular natural language, making totalizing philosophical claims shaky. This tension between universalizing philosophy and the particularity of language keeps popping up. Think Russell's quest for logical purity versus Heidegger's focus on language games, or Wittgenstein's forms of life. Hegel's massive project, in part, was about overcoming this linguistic contingency to achieve a final, absolute account, a path that ultimately leads him to declare the end of art. Hegel's famous declaration that art is ended, or rather, its role is fulfilled in philosophy, is notoriously tricky. What does he mean? If taken literally as an observation about the modern world, it's hard to argue. Sciences clearly dominate. The idea that art could play the role Greek tragedy did for the polis, Wagner and Nietzsche tried to revive it, but as a serious claim about relative importance, it sounds pretty absurd today. But Hegel is thinking bigger. He's concerned not just with the sciences, but with philosophy's role in understanding the entire trajectory of modernity. Philosophy for Hegel needs to show how the divisions brought by modernity, capitalism, individualism, the end of old myths are rationally necessary, and perhaps help forge new unities. It's here that the deep divide between idealism aiming for a final synthesis and romanticism's enduring longing for the infinite comes into sharp focus. Think back to Novalis in 1796. If we can never reach an absolute ground, philosophy becomes an endless quest, known only negatively. We act and realize what we sought wasn't found. That's the romantic stance. The result is a longing for the infinite, a regulative idea, not a final destination. Schelling's earlier view that art approaches the absolute better than philosophy echoes this. KWF Soldier, someone Hegel deeply admired, navigates this. He saw art as presenting the timeless idea, relying on the negativity of transience. Particulars are negative, dependent. The idea reveals truth beyond them. But Soldier, like the Romantics, felt this tension. The idea's universality is sacrificed when it appears in time through material. Everything has a necessary being that resists full mediation. Hegel, however, pushes back. His idealist alternative is that this resistance must be overcome through totalizing conceptual mediation. The negativity of particulars leads to their integration into a fully articulated positive totality. Henrik calls Hegel's absolute the finite to the extent to which the finite is nothing but negative relation to itself. By taking nihilism to its logical conclusion, Hegel believes it will be overcome. Frank sees Hegel's system as ironic, in the romantic sense. It works until it reaches its final, non-ironic conclusion. So Hegel is close to the Romantics in seeing the drive for the absolute arise from constant failure. But his key difference is conviction. He thinks philosophy can ultimately win this game. The danger Jacobi and the Romantics saw in conceptual thinking was nihilism. If everything's value comes only from its relations, you risk an endless regress. The only way out, they thought, was either some form of meaningful immediacy, like feeling, that resists being fully captured by concepts, or a final gathering of all mediations. This links theology and aesthetics. Schleiermacher again emphasizes feeling as expressing something irreducible, something accessible in aesthetic experience, but ultimately beyond full philosophical grasp. Hegel, though, is famously dismissive of any immediacy. He mocks Schleiermacher's religion based on feeling, joking that a dog would be the best Christian due to its feeling of dependence. Hegel's strategy? Trust the power of totalizing conceptual mediation to eventually conquer itself. The negativity of particulars gets woven into a conceptually complete positive whole. His absolute, as Henrich puts it, is the finite understood as pure negative relation to itself. By pushing nihilism to its limit, Hegel thinks it dissolves. It's like his system is ironic until it hits its final unironic note. This leads to a crucial point about art's status in Hegel's system. For philosophy to reach its absolute truth, it has to overcome the world of finite determinations more thoroughly than any particular artwork ever could. Look at this quote from his Logic. If the idea is criticized for being transcendent because no sensible object perfectly matches it, that's a misunderstanding. The idea gains its objective validity precisely because it lacks the untrue being of the objective world, appearance. Art, therefore, can only be the sensuous appearing of the idea because it's tied to this very appearance. The dignity of each art form lies in how well it negates spirit's dependence on the material world. That's why architecture is lower than music, less tied to material constraints. This flips Kant on its head. For Kant, natural beauty was primary. For Hegel, natural beauty is just a reflection of the beauty belonging to spirit. The priority shifts decisively towards spirit's intelligibility, achieved through the process of mediation. Hegel then applies this logic to the history of art, dividing it into three stages mirroring his overall dialectical progression. First, symbolic art, like the Sphinx, spirit trying to emerge from the animal, but failing because the body remains contingent. Second, classical art, the perfect union of meaning and form, where human externality reveals the spiritual, think Greek sculpture. Third, romantic art, initially Christianity, moving beyond bodily transience. Here, the randomness of the external and internal leads to a falling apart, and art negates itself, showing the need for higher forms like religion and philosophy to grasp truth. Within these stages, there's a hierarchy: architecture, sculpture, painting, music, literature. And the absolute peak? Drama, perhaps comedy, because comedy allows spirit to revel in the dissolution of particular purposes, pointing beyond art itself. This historical account provides a powerful framework, and later developments in art, like abstraction and avant-garde attacks on autonomy, fit surprisingly well. But again, we need to ask, at what level are Hegel's claims about art's end understood? If he's just observing the rise of science, he's spot on. But his deeper point is about philosophy's role in navigating modernity's transformations. He argues forcefully that progress requires overcoming aesthetic particularity, establishing general viewpoints, laws, rights, maxims as the basis for determination. This privileging of the universal over the particular is vital for countering irrationalism. Yet, it feels uncomfortably close to Max Weber's description of rationalization, draining the world of traditional meaning. And remember Hegel's line: the science of art is thus in our time much more necessary than in times in which art for itself as art provided complete satisfaction. Necessary for what? If philosophy itself, according to Hegel, can't offer complete satisfaction either, what then? Later thinkers like Heidegger and Adorno really pushed back against this Hegelian dominance. Heidegger saw Hegel showing how subjectivity's apparent limits actually drive it to transcend itself, ultimately articulating its own foundational role. But this leads to a critique: the sciences, by explaining consciousness like everything else, become independent, completing philosophy. Art, through essential poets, points towards a different kind of thinking, one that listens to being rather than imposing frameworks. Adorno agrees Hegel hypostasizes subjectivity as the absolute. He argues Hegel sees non-identity only as a barrier to subjectivity, whereas for the aesthetic subject, non-identity is its emancipation, its telos. Think of Adorno's non-identical as the romantic's immediate being, or soldier's resistance to mediation. The core issue for both Heidegger and Adorno is that resistance of the particular to being neatly classified, the source of art's unique power to reveal what philosophy and science miss. Ultimately, the clash between Hegel and the Romantics, echoed by Heidegger and Adorno, circles back to nihilism. Hegel sees mediation as the path to absolute knowledge. But Adorno and Heidegger worry that this very drive for totalizing relational thinking, whether in metaphysics, sciences, or even language viewed as differences, is deeply linked to modernity's tendency to strip things of intrinsic value, treating everything as arbitrarily defined by its relations. While pinning down exactly what constitutes this Western metaphysics or context of delusion is tricky, the underlying question about the limits of purely rule-based conceptual thinking is undeniably important. Think about sociological approaches to art heavily influenced by Hegel. Explaining art through social and historical determinants is valuable, but risks circularity. Adorno knew this was necessary, lest we ignore how the modern world shapes art. Yet, such analyses can sometimes miss what the artwork itself reveals about history, or its very resistance to being neatly slotted into categories like society or history. This tension between explaining art as part of modernity and respecting its unique capacity to disclose something beyond explanation is the lasting legacy. It's not just about art, it's about the future of philosophy itself, grappling with the constitutive role of language and the limits of control. The questions raised by German idealism about art continue to echo.